Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. My name is Natalie Ivy. I'm here presenting from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And we're going to be talking today about the dynamic of stalking, but specifically about how this dynamic and how victims of stalking that maybe don't have a relational connection to their offender, how those individuals might fall through gaps in our system. So I will give a bit of a warning here. My goal here today on this webinar is not to be total content heavy in terms of talking at you for the next hour and a half. I really hope that we can take the opportunity to engage with each other and ideally maybe learn from each other about what's working well in our communities and maybe also identifying areas in our systems, maybe some universal areas in our systems that need addressing and support, additional support to make sure that we are providing support to all victims of stalking. So I'm joined here today with my colleague, Kendra, and I'm going to let Kendra introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her experience and kind of what her perspective that she's bringing to this conversation today. Kendra?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kendra Eggleston. I'm the training and campus specialist for Spark. So I'm super excited to be part of this conversation with Natalie today. My background is working with campus professionals. I've worked with universities and on university campuses, running relationship and sexual violence prevention and awareness programs. And through my experience, I realized how important it was for us to raise awareness beyond just the intimate partner relationship violence and stalking awareness and prevention, especially with the college students who have a lot of relationships or acquaintances and other types of relationships beyond just intimate partners that they're affected by. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, my name is Natalie Ivy. My professional experience coming into this conversation is started my professional career prosecuting domestic and sexual violence crimes in a pretty rural community in Tennessee, and did that for a couple years before I transitioned into victim services and worked in all different capacities within victim service agencies that serve victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, and then a little bit more extensively victims of human trafficking as well. So you'll hear me refer to that about my own experience, things that I have certainly seen and witnessed within our systems and how that informs part of this conversation. So as I said, we work for the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. We are a federally funded organization. Two things that you can take away from that. First and foremost, what I hope you remember is that we are available, we are funded. This is what we do all day, every day, is make ourselves hopefully available to the folks who are in the field doing this work in a variety of capacities. Sometimes I term these professions as first responders. I know that can be a little bit confusing. But when we talk to these professionals, we're talking about victim advocates, law enforcement, prosecutors, judicial officials, probation officers. Pretty soon we will be able to provide guidance and support specific to healthcare providers, folks who are, again, doing the work and have the opportunity to improve our system's response and support to victims of stalking. So if you are interested in trainings, we provide those online. We provide trainings in person, oftentimes for low to no cost when possible. We provide resources on our site. And our goal here ultimately is to make your job easier. And I do hope that you remember that and walk away with that today, because as we move through this discussion, we might be identifying a lot of gaps, a lot of holes, and it's never a good feeling to just identify problems and not feel like we're walking away with some answers or some guidance. But I would really encourage you to check out our resources and see if there are ways that what we already have developed can help you in the work that you're doing. And if there's something that you're looking for and you can't find on our site, or if there is a way that we can make our resources more accessible to you, we would encourage you to reach out and let us know. The other component to this federal funding is hopefully won't be an issue here today, but should I go off course, you unfortunately cannot hold the federal government liable for this presentation today. This is a presentation of Spark and a presentation and a conversation between Kendra and I. So as I mentioned, all of our resources, for the most part, they live on our site. We have some of our resources that are protected in terms of not offering to the general public due to the nature of the content, but for the most part, you can find our trainings, our content topics online. and all of our resources there. And like I said, if there is something we can do to make those more accessible for you or more helpful for you, please reach out and let us know. I'd really encourage you to follow us on social media just so that you can stay up to date and part of the conversation as we talk about new resources coming out and talk about people who are doing good work in this field. So you can follow us there. That's our handle, and our attempt at or I guess an illustration of our sense of humor at Follow Us Legally. But we would love to have you join along with us as we continue this conversation throughout the year and talk about ways that we can continue to improve our system. All right, so let's dig in just a bit and make sure that we really have a shared understanding about what we're even talking about, right? What do we mean when we talk about stalking? One of the reasons why it's so important for us to do these trainings and to have community events is because when we talk about stalking, we are oftentimes not just providing information from a baseline lack of information. What we see when we are talking to our community and even to our partners is that there is actually a misconception, a misunderstanding of what stalking actually is. So let's make sure we're grounding ourselves in that reality. I will say I'm not going to be able to follow the chat while I talk. I cannot multitask to that extent. But Kendra, I'm going to rely on you. If you see something that stands out, please feel free to interrupt me and make sure that we're addressing any of that. But thank you guys for introducing yourselves. I'm loving seeing all of these different roles and where we are coming from all over the country. So this is fantastic. So when we talk about stalking, we use this behavioral definition to ground us in an understanding, a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So we're talking about a course of conduct. A pattern of behavior means more than one event, which in and of itself is a little bit unique when we are talking about criminal behavior and recognizing criminal behavior. The other unique element to this is it's grounded in the reality that it's going to cause fear, right? Fear for the person's safety or safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. Fear and emotional distress are emotions, obviously, and it's really difficult to prove an emotion, right? To prove beyond a reasonable doubt a person is feeling a certain way. So we always want to point that out when we are talking, particularly if we're talking to folks who have the opportunity to serve as advocates, who have the opportunity to help support victims as they are articulating and sharing their own experience, that these are big hurdles and can be difficult. These can be one of the many reasons why we as outsiders fail to see and recognize this dynamic, because sometimes it's hard for us to appreciate and understand really how someone else is feeling, all right? Now, we're not going to dig too much into any of the dynamics. If you're curious about any of these things, if already I'm saying things that are surprising you or that you have questions about, I really encourage you to check out our stalking trainings online. It's going to call them like Stalking 101, right? You can go back to some of those basics and really check out and dig into some of these points and some of these dynamics. Stalking is incredibly unique. It's incredibly difficult to recognize and to respond to. So again, if this feels like new information or kind of surprising information, I would really encourage you to check out those resources on our site. So when we talk about stalking, we're grounding ourselves in these three principles. We know that it is criminal, it's traumatic, and it's dangerous. And when we talk about that, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a crime that is defined in statutes in all 50 states, in all US territories, in most of our tribal codes, in our federal code, and in our Code of Military Justice. That tells us something. That tells us that we as a society, right, have articulated and recognized that this is behavior we want to stop. This is behavior we do not want to tolerate. This is behavior we want to hold people accountable for. And so I know that sometimes can sound simplistic, but particularly as we are doing these audits in our system, right? How is our system responding? I just think sometimes there's value in reminding ourselves of that, because we can sometimes let ourselves off the hook, right? We sometimes not hold ourselves to that standard of this is a defined crime in our statutes, and we have to treat this behavior as such. We'll talk about that a bit more as we move through here. We know that stalking is traumatic. And we'll talk a little bit about the specificities of that trauma. But the shortened version of that is victims of stalking experience a very unique form of trauma. They are experiencing chronic complex trauma. And what we see is the nature of the trauma that they are experiencing often presents in a way that causes them to not be believed. So it's like a compounded injustice, right? The effects of what they're experiencing actually contributes to the likelihood that they will not receive help from law enforcement or from victim services or from family or from friends. And so we want to make sure that we, as helpers in our community, that we're knowledgeable about this trauma, particularly, we're knowledgeable about the way that it presents, and we're prepared to educate our partners about this dynamic so that we don't have this presentation of trauma, these effects of trauma, preventing these victims from receiving the help that they deserve. We also know that stalking is dangerous, and we want to constantly draw a clear line between that stalking and those grave consequences that come from perpetrated stalking and stalking that goes unchecked. Even if we said, hey, this is a crime, we know it's a crime, but we're just not going to take it that seriously. If we have that mentality, if we have that attitude, we need to truly appreciate that attitude is going to result in loss of life. Stalking, as we will talk about a bit today, but when we dig into that data and those statistics, we are going to see stalking correlated with some of the most serious crimes in our community, like homicide, sexual violence, kidnapping. We see stalking co-occurring and that increase of those harms, the physical harm to the victim, physical harm to family, physical harm to third parties, increases every time that we identify and recognize that stalking behavior and the presence of that behavior. So as a quick reminder, we're going to talk really quickly through these stalking behaviors and what we call the SLI category. SLI is in the first letter of each of these categories, SLII. Now, when we talk about these behaviors particularly, we talk about the intent behind these behaviors. When we talk about how these behaviors might present. Here's what I mean by that. I always get a little bit nervous when we are discussing these slides because I would be guilty of this. I like lists. I like to be able to wrap my hands around something. I like to be able to know the end of the universe. Like, here's everything I need to know in this category. But I think it could be a real harm to memorize a list of behaviors and say, oh, this is what stalking looks like. I think what would be way more effective is to understand the intent behind the behavior. Because if we try to memorize the list of behaviors, first and foremost, I don't have the brain capacity to do that. But if you can do that, it's not going to serve you well because it's going to change, right? Probably by the time we get off this webinar, an offender will come up with new ways to engage in stalking behavior. So it's constantly evolving. But I also think if we are memorizing lists, we narrow our scope, right? We narrow our focus and we run the likelihood of missing behaviors that maybe aren't on the list. So when we talk about this first category, and particularly when I'm talking about these behaviors, I think it's really important to ground it in that power and control dynamic. If you have done work in the field of gender-based violence, that dynamic is familiar to you, but it's not a dynamic that we oftentimes apply to stalking. We look at stalking on the surface as just a behavior, but we don't tie it into that same cycle that we see in other gender-based violence. So when we talk about surveillance, we talk about the intent here. The intent behind these behaviors is to collect information for the purpose of causing future harm. That is the point of these behaviors. And I always want to point out when we are talking about surveillance, and I want to be careful about the way I say this so it doesn't sound like I'm giving a stalker a compliment, but if the individual was really proficient, if they were effective in their stalking behaviors, there's a high likelihood that a victim has no idea that the surveillance stage is even happening. Right? They can be collecting information without the victim even being aware. But the idea is they are collecting information with the intent of causing future harm. So they maybe are collecting logistical information about the victim, where the victim works, where the victim parks, what classes the victim takes, does the victim lock their back door? These are logistical pieces of information about that individual's life. They might be collecting kind of emotional or relational information about the victim, right? Did the victim just move to a new city? Did the victim just go through a bad breakup? Is the victim seeking a promotion at work, right? They're looking for opportunities to invade and to create harm in that victim's life. And so they might be looking for that as well. Kendra, can you think of any other information that a stalker might be trying to gain during the surveillance stage?
Yeah, and I actually, Teresa just put this into the chat and was a really good point, that final bullet point, the proxy stalking, and especially with my experience on college campuses, how prevalent this can be using a third party to gain information about the victim. And that could be that third party may not even know that they are giving information to a stalker. So that could be, hey, I know Natalie was interviewing for a new job. Did she get this new job? I want to send her flowers to congratulate her. And like, oh no, she has her interview tomorrow, but I'll let you know if she gets it, right? And I may have given someone information unintentionally, or I know they're really stressed about their exam. Have they made it back to their dorm yet? I want to check in on them. My spidey senses went off the other day at PetSmart. There was a cute older couple there with their puppy, and they asked if someone was there working that day because that person wanted to see their new dog. And immediately I was like, oh, surveillance, right? Collecting information. But yeah, just that routine, that pattern, who they're close to, when they're vulnerable. And again, that proxy stalking is really can be detrimental because that's creating potential additional victims who maybe later realize that they had caused harm unintentionally. And so then that feeling of guilt of giving that information to the stalker can be detrimental to those people as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a great example. I think sometimes we're wired differently when we do the work that we do. That example at Petco or PetSmart is fantastic because I think that's also hopefully an example of that delineation between we can collect information about others, right? But if we're not intending to cause future harm, it doesn't fall into this category of stalking behaviors. And that's really the critical thinking that goes into determining the intent. What is the purpose of gathering this information? That's a great example. All right, so our next category is life invasion. And the intent behind these behaviors is to start to exert that power and control in the victim's life. You don't have control over my presence in your life. You can't keep me out of your life. I have power over you. And so the offender, the stalker, is communicating that message through just their presence alone, right? That might be physical presence, maybe showing up at the park bench across from the victim's place of work, maybe the kid's baseball game, right? It might be a virtual presence, calling excessively, sending messages on social media. But again, it's starting to plant that seed of power and control of clearly communicating to the victim that they are unable to insulate or protect themselves from this person in their life. They do not have the ability to keep them out of their life. So we see this next category. I'm actually going clockwise around this chart here, but we see intimidation as our next stage. And so when an individual is engaging in these types of behaviors, this is showing the victim, not only am I present in your life, but you should fear my presence. My presence should make you be concerned. And the offender, the stalker, is communicating that through overt threats, right? Maybe through inadvertent symbolic violence. They maybe are threatening to harm or to negatively affect the victim's family members, friends, pets, right? They are communicating to the victim that I can create negative consequences in your life. So that fear contributes to that power, right? That feeling of power that an offender might have over a victim's life. When you see me, you should be afraid. And then our last category, that interference, is when the offender causes the harm. So they might, during that intimidation stage, threaten harm, right? And then they might cause harm. And you can see how all these cycles, and they don't have to go necessarily in a linear fashion. We certainly see surveillance being used on the front end primarily just because the offender needs that information to carry out the other crimes. But we see that harm, that interference stage, kind of complements to some degree all of these other stages, because if I cause harm in your life, then the next time that I just show up, right, I invade it. I'm just present in your life, it has a heightened effect on you, right? The feeling of fear, concern increases, and that increases the offender's power and control. That same dynamic, same mentality. So we know, as we've already alluded to, when we are trying to parcel out and identify these behaviors, context is going to be so critical. We may have an offender, a stalker, engage in actions and behaviors that in and of themselves are overtly criminal, right? We may have them slashing tires. We may have them breaking and entering into a home. But what we see a lot of times is behaviors that on the surface do not appear to be criminal. And if we, as outsiders, right, as helpers, do not use critical thinking skills to identify the context, then it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for us to really understand what's happening in that victim's life. So if we are not asking critical questions, if we are not looking below the surface, we might just encounter a coworker who gets a lovely delivery of flowers, right? We might think nothing of it. And in fact, we might fawn over it a little bit. Oh, those are so beautiful. I wish somebody would do that for me. But if we had the tenacity and the intention and the lens, right, to be looking for context, to be asking critical questions, particularly if we see that coworker's face, maybe all the color drains from it, right? Maybe they look a little bit physically ill at this delivery. If we ask critical questions, what we might actually learn, those flowers represent very significant symbolic violence, right? But it requires us to do that with some intention and to make a point to ask those questions. So one of the researchers we partner with really closely describes stalking as homicide in slow motion, which I think is a really great way to encapsulate not only the level of fear and the gravity associated with this crime, but also the fact that this is occurring in plain sight, right? That compounded, it's almost inherently gaslighty feeling for victims. They are experiencing, we might hear a victim describe this as being hunted, right? They are experiencing extreme threats to their life and their safety, and it's happening right in front of family member and friends and coworkers and students and you name it. And nobody really recognizes it and nobody's responding to it. So let's talk about the prevalence of this crime in our community. We know statistically that 1 in 3 women will experience stalking in their lifetime. Nearly 1 in 3 women, nearly 1 in 6 men will experience stalking in their lifetime. We recognize that statistic probably does not immediately correlate to the data that you might be seeing in your systems, either within a victim service agency, right? Are we serving victims of stalking at the same rate that we're serving victims of intimate partner violence? Are we naming it that at the same rate? Within our criminal legal system, we probably are not charging stalking at the same rate that we are some of those other crimes like intimate partner violence. And so I would really encourage you. I know my default sometimes when I'm trying to take the temperature of my own community, how serious is this here? What does this look like for us? Is sometimes using those own little data points to inform me, right? How often is this showing up at victim services? How often is this showing up in our systems? But we know that's not an accurate representation of the actual experience of stalking in our community for a lot of reasons. But we know that we are not charging, we are not naming, we're not responding to stalking at the same rate that our community is actually experiencing it. And that's a whole nother training for another day. If you're interested in that or you're curious about that, I really hope that today you will understand and appreciate. I just a word of warning that if you are thinking and applying it to what those data points might be in your own community, that you look at those numbers or consider the presence or lack of presence of stalking in those systems, not as truth and complete total, but really more as an indication of whether or not our communities and our systems are actually responding to this crime. All right, so this really starts to break down what we're going to be talking about today. Because so often when we talk about stalking, it is under that same umbrella within our gender-based violence crimes, right? So oftentimes it's in the same conversation as crimes like intimate partner violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, right? And obviously, we see a co-occurrence with stalking dynamics and intimate partners. But what's really telling on this chart is the fact that we have a portion of our victim population that fall into what I'm going to call non-relational victims. So these are victims who fall in the category of acquaintance, stranger, brief encounter, potentially person of authority, right? They are not relationally connected to their offender. And the reason I want to talk about that today is to really assess, understandably so, rightfully so, our systems are equipped and prepared, hopefully, to have a heightened response to victims of intimate partner violence, right? To have a heightened response to the crime of sexual violence and maybe even human trafficking in your community. We recognize how important that is, but what we oftentimes are not considering is if we have a victim of stalking who is a non-relational victim, we're not really assessing or thinking through how those individuals might be navigating our systems and how our systems might be contributing to a lack of reporting and a lack of support. So really quickly, some things to keep in mind when we talk about acquaintance stalking victims. We know there is a correlation between physical assault and acquaintance stalking. 1 in 4 were assaulted by their stalker. I think it's incredibly telling to see the average length of stalking victimization, on average 2.5 years. Obviously, this creates dramatic disruption to personal and professional lives. These are individuals who are having to mitigate victimization, being actively victimized on a weekly basis. We know studies tell us that a good majority of our victims are experiencing this victimization at least once a week, if not more. They're doing this for 2 years, 2.5 years. They're having to protect themselves, promote their own safety, survive to a lot of degrees, while also navigating life and managing all of the other responsibilities in their life. We know that there is a correlation between acquaintance stalking and sexual assault. So nearly half of acquaintance stalking victims were sexually assaulted by the stalker. We see an increase in those indications that are those red flag indicators for cases, things like increased jealousy, attempts to control, increased physical violence. We see a high level of resource loss, right? And the big takeaway here is the victims in those non-relational categories are experiencing extreme harm, and these are serious cases in our community. There is real value in making sure that these individuals are not dropping through the gaps in our systems. So what we're going to do here today is do a little bit of an audit, right, of all of these different systems. And like I said, hopefully have a little bit of feedback. Now, before you all get scared and jump off, I will say, we hope that we set this up in a way that you can participate anonymously. You do not have to come off mute unless you want to. We would love to hear from folks, but we hope that you will share your perspective and just some insight into what's happening in your community and your systems so that we can get a good feel for what this looks like across the country. So let's first and foremost talk about victim services. As I mentioned earlier, we know that the majority of stalking victims are not even reporting or seeking services from victim service agencies. That is a pretty big hurdle for us to face. It's hard for us to help if we don't even know who needs help. So we want to think about why. Why is it that the majority of stalking victims are not reporting or seeking services? We know it can probably be a pretty complicated answer, but let's think through what that might look like in your community. When we see victims of stalking, we see not only a low amount reporting, but we see a low amount actually receiving services. So what's happening with victims who are trying to access services or looking for services in your community? So let's take a minute. You can log in here. This is going to be the kind of method for us collecting information and collecting answers from you. So you can join really easily by text, over phone. You can join on the web. If you scan that QR code, I think it's going to take you to the website. And like I said, the information that you're sharing here today is anonymous and hopefully is just more of collecting some basic conversation points about our systems and the way that they're working. So let's take a look at our first question here. What services are available to non-relational victims of stalking in your community? So you can answer more than once. And I would just ask, I'm curious to know, what services are you positive are available to victims of non-relational victim to to non-relational victims of stalking in your community. Okay, so it has to be something that you are pretty confident about, not just I think we've got this. But do you offer emergency housing, legal advocacy, or maybe not even you? Are there agencies in your community that offer this? Needs assistance, food, medicine, supplies, mental health assistance, long-term housing assistance. Maybe we don't really have a lot of services available. Uh, Maybe you're not sure, right? That's a good question. I don't know if you have to have a relational connection to the offender to qualify for some of these services. So, and Kendra, feel free to pop in if you have anything you want to share. Let's take a look at these answers as they're coming in.
As people are responding, I was going to say I am monitoring the chat for questions as well as the Q&A box. So if you've typed in a question, I have it pinned so we can circle back to those questions. So if you
Great.
have questions in the chat, we appreciate it and we will be answering those. So, and if you for some reason have issues with the poll everywhere, feel free to respond in the chat and we'll read out from some of those as well.
Awesome. And I think somebody had mentioned about in the military, we have protective orders. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to actually talk about those protective orders in just a bit. Right now, we're talking about services that traditionally would fall under victim service agencies, maybe nonprofit organizations in your community. So these are not necessarily correlated with engaging any legal system. They're unique, are kind of standalone services to victims of crime. All right, so thank you first and foremost that you're participating. I always have nightmares before a presentation like this that I'm going to throw up a poll and have no participants. So thank you for not leaving me hanging here. But it looks like predominantly we're seeing quite a bit of legal advocacy, which is great. We do see some emergency housing, which is fantastic. That's not always available to victims of non-relational crimes. That needs assessment, the mental health assistance, which is fantastic. I do want to point out, though, we've got a couple folks who are honest, like, I don't know. I don't know what services are available, which makes total sense. If you are not in that field, if you have never had family members or friends who maybe have gone through this experience, I know I have done this work for the majority of my life, but I have quite a few family members who are really insulated from this entire world, right? And they would have no concept about what's available in their community or what that might look like in their community. We also have a couple who are being honest about there's not services available. There's just no resources. There's no focus on that, which is really an important part of that conversation, right? Something we want to be paying attention to when we think about and we assess why aren't victims reporting or why are we not prosecuting victims? Where are these cases? How are they falling through the gaps? So let's take a second. This is a word cloud exercise. So because it's a word cloud, if you can, and this is the worst possible thing you could ask me to do, try to answer in one word. It's hard, I know, but that'll give us it helps ground us in our answers a little bit. But when you think about a victim of stalking, and I'm talking about a victim in general, they don't even have to be a non-relational victim. How are they going to find services in your area? So John threw out police, and I'm assuming that means that the police would refer them to victim services. That's a clear referral process. Let's see what this looks like. Google, yeah. So if you know how a word cloud works, the more that somebody's putting in the same word, the bigger that word gets. All right, so we're popping. We got lots of words coming in, but our biggest words, it looks like to me, are Google, enforcement, I'm assuming law enforcement, police. Yeah, hotline, I'm seeing pop up quite a bit. Search, yeah. This is great. So one of the things we want to talk about when we talk about this, what I would call a referral process, right, is think about the nature, particularly of victim services. At least in my experience, I've worked in agencies that are incredibly in incredibly rural communities, right? So one agency I worked for, we were the sole victim service agency for 13 counties in Tennessee. That's how big the geographic region was that we were serving. And we were a product, as most victim service agencies are, of a grassroots evolution, right? Because we worked in small towns and because we worked building off of this history of grassroots activism, Our best referral service was word of mouth, right? People knew about us. People maybe knew family members or friends who needed services, and that's how people connected to us, which is great. That is fantastic. In fact, I would say family members, friends, those in-person referrals, right? Those kind of relational referrals are high quality because the person making the referral, the family member or the friend, has a vested interest in the victim getting help. So they want to do that with a lot of information. They're going to give high quality guidance on getting that victim to the services. The kind of flip side of that, though, that word of mouth referral process is if you are a victim who is not lucky enough to have a family member or friend who is in the know, if you're new to a community, then you lack that ability to gain that information, right? You lack that ability to be referred to victim services. So oftentimes what we've seen, and we see it here quite a bit, like law enforcement, hotlines, all of those, again, are fantastic if they happen. All of those referral processes require a couple steps to happen on the front end, right? Law enforcement has to be involved. There has to be a reason why there have been eyes or involvement in the situation. We know that the internet, Google, right? That's one of our biggest words here on this word cloud. We know the internet is going to be probably one of the most common, but also the most consistent ways for a victim to find out what services are available in their community. So I would encourage you to think through the internet process and what that looks like for your community. I'll give you a little example. I use my hometown here as an example. And if I was pretending to be a victim of stalking who was looking for help, this is what popped up, stalking in Asheville. And when you scroll through here, you can see Family Justice Center popped up, civil no contact order, some resources about that, some resources about attorneys, Family Justice Center, Stop Domestic Violence and Abuse, right? And even as we are getting down into some of these service providers, you see here at the bottom, resources relative to those affected by rape, sexual assault, abuse, and it actually doesn't even include stalking, right? So the reason I would encourage you to practice that exercise is go through that process and look at these results from the eyes of a non-relational victim. If we were a non-relational victim of stalking and we were Googling for services or we were internet searching for services here in our community, in my community, I don't know that any of these answers would stand out to me as services that are relative to me, right? All of these services are excellent. Family Justice Center is fantastic, but just by its name, Family Justice Center, or even by its description, I might look at these and say, I don't qualify for any of these services. I can't even call, right? These are not agencies that would receive my call. Kendra, do you have any thoughts about that, about seeking services, or maybe what that might look like on campus? Some hurdles that victims of non-relational stalking might face seeking services on campus.
Yeah, I think especially about sexual assault prevention and response programs, like the one that I was responsible for was called Relationship Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention. And so we had to really work extra hard to make sure that students knew that could be any type of relationship, not an intimate partner relationship. So roommate, family that might not be on campus, professor, or if they work on campus, their employer. But it really does take that added level of educating your community, whatever your community is, on what services are available. I also think of like crime victim services on campus. Again, if victims don't recognize that what's happening to them is a crime, or what's happening isn't one of the overt crimes, like you mentioned, whether it's property damage or assault, if they're experiencing someone following them on campus or leaving gifts or incessant social media contact, if they don't recognize that's a crime, they're not going to go to crime victim services or the conduct office. So it really is on us, on the professionals, to make sure that we're advertising and marketing our resources and support in the way that is accessible, and making sure that students know and community members know that they can access them.
Absolutely. And it goes back to that power of words, right? And understanding not only might you discourage a victim from reporting, but even more horrifically, the lack of availability, the lack of accessibility, the lack of communication about it might send its own message to a victim of non-relational stalking, which is you're not really a victim. What you're experiencing is not a crime. And so that can really compound that experience and cause actual harm in that victim's life. All right, so let's think about what hurdles a non-relational victim might face when searching for services in your community. And we talked through some of these already, but when we think about this, if you are doing that internet search exercise, or maybe you've already done it, I saw some folks in the chat have already tried it out, see what that looks like. Or you just you know what the process looks like, you know that the way it's communicated. Think through, and again, you may answer more than one here. A hurdle might be that there are no services available. A hurdle might be that maybe the victim service agency in your name, in your community, the name of it in and of itself causes confusion. So many of our victim service agencies, when they started, were centered around that relational connection. My sister's keeper, my mother's house, right? Sometimes we even use those family names in there. The focus of the services might create confusion. The available agencies are not articulating the services that they offer to non-relational victims. So we're kind of identifying, like, we acknowledge it might be extra difficult for a victim of non-relational stalking to recognize what services are available to them. Thinking about just the power, the value, and clearly articulating that on a website, on ways that we are promoting our services or promoting what's available to our public at large. The available agencies may not advertise services in ways that are accessible, and other types of hurdles. And I'm seeing some other types of hurdles already come in the chat. So I'm super interested to dig into those. But let's take a look at what we're saying. Yeah, the agencies not advertising services in an acceptable way seems like that might be a really common issue. And able to get to the service due to lack of transportation. Someone mentioned 100%, as I said earlier, working in an area that was a huge geographic region. And on top of that, we had victims who were incredibly geographically isolated. And so we recognized it was a huge hurdle if a victim in a geographically isolated location needed to get to the emergency shelter. That was tough. That was tough. That really created some difficulties. Hours of agency staffing, yeah, funding for staffing, that availability for agencies, 100%. That clear articulation, it looks like we're seeing that across the board. And I think that might be an oversight to some degree. I don't know how you feel about that, Kendra, but having done a lot of work in victim services, I don't know of any advocate, I don't know of any agency I've ever worked for where we have ever taken the mindset of, we don't want to encourage phone calls, we don't want to encourage reporting. But I don't know that we always took the time to think about other victim populations and making sure that we were reaching out and articulating to them specifically and with real intention. What are your thoughts about that, if you have any?
I also think even in agency namings and things like that, a popular agency here in Tarrant County is the Women's Center of Tarrant County, which started as a rape crisis center specifically for women. And now they've expanded their services to beyond just rape crisis, and they serve men, women, children, families, but still keeping that name. And then I think of other types of intersecting identities, thinking about our LGBTQ plus population and relationships, and or am I going to be served if I go to the Family Justice Center or to the Women's Center, if I identify as male or non-binary, or even just thinking of the younger generation and the complexities of what qualifies or constitutes an intimate partner relationship versus a friend that may have become intimate and isn't, and where do I get services, and does this qualify? So even just taking those types of complexities and context into consideration and making sure, again, that we are intentional about how we make sure that people know that the services can encapsulate all of those types of victimizations and identities, and being culturally specific and responsible in those ways as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Someone just shared in the chat about changing the name of the agency, which I know is no small feat. It's not easy to do. It can be really difficult. It can be scary. There's a branding component to that. But doing that with the intention to increase that awareness of inclusivity and to be very clear and consistent about the types of services that agency is offering. So, when we talk about victim services in general, for folks who are on the call today here who work in the victim service field, in general, we just have some suggestions, some recommendations that we would really encourage you to incorporate, to think about what you're currently doing and think about ways that you can incorporate a stalking lens, incorporate a stalking lens and service to non-relational victims, particularly, and what you're already doing. When we talk about those shelter options, I will be honest, was very encouraged to see so many of you say, we offer emergency shelter to non-relational victims. I've been in a lot of communities where if a victim of stranger stalking came home and their home was broken into, and maybe they call law enforcement, and law enforcement responds and takes a report and secures the home, that victim's options for that night are either to stay in that home that has been broken into or to pay for a hotel, right? To find their own funding, to find alternative housing for themselves that night. They don't always have that same connection to emergency housing that we oftentimes correlate with intimate partner violence. And so I'm glad to see that we have a lot of communities across the country that do offer that. But that's one I would really pay attention to and think about in your community. If it's 3 in the morning and we have a victim of stranger stalking, do they have a safe place to go in your community? I think that's a really important part of not only supporting victims, but saving lives. We have these resources available on our site that you certainly could check out that are relative to improving our response for domestic violence and sexual violence organizations. This also has a quick little clip of our campus professionals. We're going to dig into that in just a bit. But in general, these are our guiding questions when we are auditing our own agencies, right? When we're thinking critically about the services that we're offering. Are we incorporating stalking into, from a victim service perspective, into the conversation in our coordinated community responses? Maybe you call them MDTs, those multidisciplinary teams, maybe as task forces. Are you bringing the conversation of stalking, and particular non-relational stalking topic to the table? Making sure that we have training, making sure that we're emphasizing, participating, recognizing National Stalking Awareness Month, which is in January, and making sure that we're prepared to respond to victims of stalking, whether it's safety planning, risk assessment, offender accountability, all of those components, and knowing what is relative to your agency and the services you offer, but really being honest with yourselves about the quality of those services and ways that you might be able to improve them. All right, so let's look at law enforcement response to victims of non-relational stalking or non-relational victims of stalking, and really start to identify if there are gaps in the system, right? Ways that we are maybe failing to serve or failing to respond to non-relational victims that is different than the way that we respond to relational victims. So in general, when we talk about victims of stalking, we know there's a lot of reasons why, a lot of influences on why victims are not reporting to police to begin with. That not important enough to report. I think that really speaks to that contextual nature of those behaviors, right? We said this right at the beginning of our training. But when we talk about these behaviors that require context, a victim might be very aware of the fact that it's going to be hard for someone else who does not have context to understand why a delivery of flowers is terrifying. And that awareness, the fact that the victim is aware of that, they will never understand, right? They won't get it. They don't have context, prevents them from reporting in the first place, right? We also see kind of these reportings of attitudes or mentalities about the police can't do anything, they can't help. And part of that is, unfortunately, from some negative experiences that individuals might have with the system. But the other part of that is this form of trauma. We talked about this complex and chronic trauma. We know from a neurological perspective, right? That form of trauma inherently creates a level of hopelessness, right? Or even a level of helplessness. There is no way that this is going to end. No one can stop it. Nobody can keep it from happening again. And so that can really contribute to that lack of reporting across the board. So as I think I've mentioned earlier today, but we know research shows us that victims rely on that notion of what's going to be seen as a real crime. What can we clearly correlate to as this is an obvious crime and something that I should be reporting to law enforcement. And we know the nature of stalking really inhibits victims' ability to identify these behaviors, these terrorizing, traumatic criminal behaviors as crime. Because they hide under that context, they kind of, the lack of overtness of the behaviors can make it really difficult for the victim. And unfortunately, we know that it's easy for practitioners to view stalking as a mild trauma, maybe not receive that same level of gravity, that same level of response, that same level of urgency, not only from law enforcement, but from victim service agencies as well. But we want to make sure that we are prepared and that we are approaching these cases with that same level of urgency, of gravity that it requires, right? Here's what I mean by that. We know in general, I'm going to make some kind of general statements. I'm going to hear from you in specificity in just a bit, but we know in general, best practices tell us that for law enforcement, when they are responding to crimes relative to intimate partner violence, that there is value, life-saving value, in that law enforcement officer addressing that case with a level of gravity, right? Kind of a more potentially intensive response. And one of the ways that law enforcement does that is through risk assessments. Risk assessments are ways for law enforcement or other types of providers, other types of responders to measure the risk that this victim is facing. And ultimately, this can help a victim improve their safety planning, their response, and ideally help save lives, right? So let's talk about what we're doing in our community. Your law enforcement agency currently conducts risk assessments when there's evidence of intimate partner violence, there's evidence of stalking, regardless of the relationship between the offender and the victim. They're doing it when the responding officer chooses, or maybe it's a detective in the case, depending on kind of the policy or protocol. Maybe your law enforcement doesn't currently conduct risk assessments, and there might be a lot of reasons why. You may not know, right? And there might be a lot of reasons why our public at large doesn't necessarily know when law enforcement is doing this. But I would wager, I would argue that is an important part of the conversation. We'll dig into that in just a bit. Yeah, I hope you don't mind. I'll keep names private, but someone mentioned to the host and panelists, which is such a great point. It's easy to see a bruise, but it takes understanding to see and understand emotional injuries. And that's so true. It's that critical thinking, right? It takes critical thinking. It takes extra work to dig down and to actually recognize stalking behaviors. These are not behaviors that come to the surface automatically. All right, so we split here as these are rolling in. Right now, we're seeing quite a few who say, yeah, when there's evidence of intimate partner violence, and that makes sense, right? That is best practice right now for those to be done during those cases. We know that those cases have a high risk of lethality and certainly deserve a heightened level of response, no doubt. We have quite a bit of our audience today saying, I'm not really sure. I don't really know when they're doing or risk assessments, which is totally fair, right? So our point with this conversation and this question is, if we are doing them with intimate partner, or when there's indications of intimate partner violence, it tells me that law enforcement agency recognizes the value of risk assessments. And I would challenge those agencies to think about that same logic, right? It's important for us to do it in these cases because it helps save lives. It helps us identify high-risk cases. All of the reasons why, all of the justifications for doing it in cases relative to intimate partner violence, all of those hold true for cases of stalking, even if the victim does not know the offender. Now, the other kind of group here who are saying, I'm not really sure. I think that's an interesting component. And I think it's worth a conversation with your community partners. Because for me, I think for law enforcement, there's real value in your community partners knowing when and how you're doing risk assessments, right? It shows that level of intention. This is the way we're approaching these cases. This is how we're helping provide support. But I also think it's important for community members, and particularly our partners, to have a vested interest in this process, right? What does that look like? And maybe are there ways that we could better support you, law enforcement? If you're doing these risk assessments in the field, is there a way for victim services to provide supportive services in the field? Is there a way for that referral process to improve? Whatever that is, right? I just think there's a lot of room for community connection and partnership relative to risk assessments, particularly. So if you're answering, I'm not sure, and you work in the system in some capacity, I would really encourage you to ask that question, right? Find out. Talk to someone. And if you're finding that a lot of people are not sure, then maybe it's a good opportunity for a big conversation in your community. So, as I mentioned earlier, all of those same justifications and explanations for using risk assessments with cases that indicate intimate partner violence, we know that those same reasons are true, those same justifications, that same logic holds true for all of stalking cases. I do want to point out, though, it's difficult sometimes to screen for stalking with assessments that we are using for intimate partner violence. Those assessments are hinging on, right? They're based off of that relational connection. And if we know that there is a big chunk of our victim population that does not have a relational connection to their offender, then those assessments might not be incredibly effective. We might fail to even conduct them when we should, right? It might not be the best way to really address and assess risk in those cases. So one harassment assessment, stalking harassment assessment and risk profile we want to point you to is the course, goodness, coercivecontrol.org. I'm getting tongue-tied. So this is the SHARP, this assessment that is focused specifically on stalking and harassing behavior. And one of our close partners, a researcher who does work in this field, has developed this risk profile to help improve our communal response to stalking behaviors and harassing behaviors, and really start to assess those cases that are high risk so that we can improve our response to them. So you can check this out. You can go onto the site. You can actually go through a little practice run, which is lovely. I would really encourage you to do that. But this can be a really helpful guide for you, particularly for law enforcement, to help shore up those gaps in the system, right? If we recognize, oh yeah, we're doing risk assessments over here, but we're not necessarily doing them over here for victims of stalking, this can be a really great resource for you and one we would highly recommend. So in general, we've got some checklist suggestions that we would recommend in looking at the way that we are responding to stalking cases and the way that we are designing our policies and protocols, right? That in the same way that we probably have specialized responses to other types of cases, sexual violence, human trafficking, intimate partner violence, making sure that we have that same mindset, that same specialization, that same heightened response to cases of stalking. And I would even say before you can have that heightened response, you have to be intentional about screening for stalking, looking for stalking to make sure that we're identifying it adequately. So we have some policies and protocols that are some suggestions for our law enforcement partners. I'm not going to go into those in great detail today, but we will be sharing these slides. You can take a look at them. And a lot of this lives, as I mentioned earlier, on our resources, where we talk through ways that we can improve our policy procedure response, that we can make little changes in the work that we're already doing. We don't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily, but we can improve our ability to recognize this and respond to it. So, and I'll also just remind you, we are available to help with trainings as well. And so if we are wanting to implement some of this new policy and procedure, if we're wanting to look at the way that our agencies are responding to stalking, we're happy to help with that in any way that we can. One thing I do want to point out is the value of case data and case analysis, really going back through having a system in place to have another set of eyes, a fresh set of eyes, some kind of analysis of our responses, reports that we're taking in the community to really assess and parcel out to see, is it possible that this is part of a stalking behavior, right? You heard me say it earlier. You're probably going to hear me say it again. But stalking is not a crime that is naturally going to come to the surface. Well, gosh, if there was stalking, somebody would have told us, right? It would have made itself apparent. The reality is we have to dig for it. We have to look for it. We have to prove to ourselves that it's not happening. And so that case data, that case analysis can be really helpful with that. As I mentioned, the training and improving response, we're available to help with that. And these are resources that are specific to law enforcement that are available on our site. And of course, if you have any questions about those, or as I mentioned, if there's something you're looking for that we don't have, please feel free to reach out and let us know, and we can work with you to help improve your systems and your response. All right, so let's look at our criminal legal system. And again, we're posing that question: do victims of kind of relational victims of stalking receive a different response in the criminal legal system than non-relational victims of stalking? So let's just think through it really quickly. In general, in your community, do intimate partner violence cases, domestic assault, all of those things, do they receive a specialized response in your criminal legal system? What I mean by that is, do those cases get put on a special docket? Do those cases get automatically assigned a special victim witness coordinator? Do those cases maybe get a referral to the victim service agency? Maybe there's a victim service advocate that's in court and the prosecutor says, oh, you're a victim of domestic violence. You need to go talk to the advocate at some point today. Sorry, I'm having to close my blinds because I'm getting burning sunshine in here. Is there something in your system that you are doing that gets triggered automatically if someone is charged with a crime relative to intimate partner violence? So you might say, yeah, we've got some extra supportive measures for intimate partner violence cases. You might say intimate partner violence cases are treated the same as all other criminal prosecutions. Let me know what that looks like for you and your community. We'll take a look at the answers as they come in here. All right, not surprising. We're seeing quite a few saying, yeah, we have extra supportive measures. That's fantastic. That's great. I'm going to argue that's necessary, right? For those of us who are saying, oh gosh, intimate partner violence is treated the same as all other criminal cases, I hope that means all your cases are treated with a high level of intensity and support. I hope that's what that means. But what we know to be true with these types of cases that can be very difficult to prosecute, can be dangerous, can be long-term, can be intensive, it is important, it is valuable, it is necessary for us to have extra support for victims in those cases. If we want the victims to participate, if we want the victims to find safety and stability, we have to have those extra supportive measures. So we're seeing quite a bit of those come in, which is fantastic. So if we consider that, right, yeah, we do have special dockets. We have special advocates. We have special prosecutors, right? We have a specific prosecutor. That's what I did when I first started work. I only took domestic violence and sexual violence cases. I was a specialized prosecutor in that field. So if we take that and we say, we look at that from the non-relational victim, would a non-relational victim of stalking receive the same supportive measures in your criminal legal system? Would they get triggered to have a specialized prosecutor, victim witness coordinator? Would they get referred to victim services? What does that look like? So the first there is that all stalking cases, regardless of relation to the offender, receive supportive measures across the board. I think that's what it says, Kendra. I'm not clicked into it, so I can't see the rest of that sentence, but I don't know if you are. Okay. After I said that, I started second guessing myself. All right, so the second is the victim may receive extra support at the discretion of the assigned prosecutor. So maybe the prosecutor identifies this non-relational victim of stalking needs to talk to an advocate or needs supportive services, and that's when that would get triggered. Non-relational victims of stalking don't typically receive the same support. I don't know. That's a fair answer. Or maybe it's other. And if it's other, I would love if you would throw it into the chat. That'd be super helpful. Let's see what we're saying. So a lot of I don't know, which is totally fair. All stalking cases, regardless of relation to the offender, receive supportive measures in our system. That's fantastic. And I'm curious about that. Again, if anybody wants to share in the chat, if we're talking about those cases, we're talking about where stalking is charged specifically, correct? Or is it any time that stalking behavior is identified? I'm assuming that's probably going to be relative to the charge. but I'm curious about that. I'm curious and I'm hopeful. Okay, stalking charge, I see, which makes sense, right? We have to come up with ways that we are identifying these cases, ways that are quick, and we can process as quickly as we're handling all of the work that has to get done in the day. All right, so when we think about this, again, our big picture takeaway here, if you're answering A, love to hear it. That's fantastic. My challenge to you would be think about cases that are not charge stalking on their face, right? Maybe they come in as a breaking and entering. Maybe they come in as destruction of property, right? Tires slashed. They might come in other ways, but we are dealing with a victim of stalking and maybe a victim of non-relational stalking. Is there a way in yours? And then I know that I'm asking a loaded question, but is there a way in our systems to identify those victims and provide that supportive measure? I don't know. I'd love to see it. If it's at the discretion of the prosecutor, I would love to drill into that. If that's the case for you and your community, I would encourage you, and maybe you already know, but really inform yourself and educate yourself about what does that look like? When do they decide to provide those supportive measures? And again, for those folks who don't know, this is a great opportunity for conversation, right? Because you might ask a question that causes someone else, maybe someone in the prosecutor's office, to take a second to think, oh gosh, I don't know. Maybe we don't, or maybe we do, or maybe we should change up the way that we're doing our process, the way that we're providing those supportive measures. So we know as stalking cases in general, when we look from a prosecution perspective, from a criminal legal perspective, these are long and difficult cases. We know that these are the types of cases that need supportive measures. If we want victims to participate, if we want victims to be safe, if we want victims to heal, right, to stabilize, we have to be providing supportive measures across the board to them through this process. Whoop. All right, so let's dig into the civil legal system here. Oop, going a little too fast. All right, we're doing another word cloud. So again, try to answer in one word. I know that's a little bit difficult, but what forms of civil legal relief might be available to a victim of intimate partner violence in your community? And somebody had already mentioned a protective order. That might be a civil legal process that is a relief, a form of relief that's available to a victim of intimate partner violence. What are other forms of civil legal relief? Needed to do some vocal warm-ups before this training today, getting tongue-tied. And you can go beyond orders of protection, right? Think about in child support, think about in bankruptcy court, right? Family court, think about across your civil legal systems. If a victim is engaging the civil legal system with an abuser, if they are identified as a victim of intimate partner violence, do they get any specialized relief response? Maybe they have separate dockets. Maybe they have different ways that they conduct hearings. Maybe they've got more intention in what they are offering victims of intimate partner violence. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of protective orders, which makes total sense. I'm so glad some folks are mentioning that kind of compensation, right? Compensation for the criminal crime that's present. But also maybe it's financial support. Maybe they have added support relative to parenting, to custody hearings, restraining orders. I love some folks are mentioning leases, right? Assistance with housing and rental issues. All of those could be things that we are identifying are unique needs of victims of intimate partner violence, right? They are unique to victims of intimate partner violence, but they're not exclusive to victims of intimate partner violence. I would argue so many of these issues that you guys are putting up there, which are fantastic, they are also relative to victims that do not know their stalker, right? Who have no relational connection to their stalker. Does a non-relational victim still need a protection order? Absolutely. Might a non-relational victim of stalking need assistance in getting out of their lease, right? And addressing some housing issues? Absolutely. So we want to think about that and compare the ways that we are providing that really robust and fantastic support to victims of intimate partner violence. And again, think through ways that we might be able to provide it to non-relational victims of stalking. So I just want to point out this data, the statistic is not a home run. I would love to say, gosh, when a victim of stalking gets an order of protection, it has 90% efficacy, right? It's not a home run, but it's also not nothing. we know that kind of right in that range of half of offenders stop their behavior after that order of protection is issued. So there is some value, there is some real efficacy in a victim, a non-relational victim, obtaining this civil relief. So what hurdles might a victim face in obtaining similar forms of relief if there was no relational connection to the offender? And I want you to think for just a second too. Think critically about your process, particularly with orders of protection. When you apply for an order of protection, and times that I have assisted individuals in applying for orders of protection, there is inevitably a question about the respondent, right? You probably need to know some information about them to be able to serve it, to be able to start the process. So if you are experiencing stalking from a total stranger, how do you obtain an order of protection? What does that look like? Yeah, may not know the address. You may not even know the name of the offender, right? It makes it incredibly difficult for victims of stranger stalking to access the same levels of civil relief that victims of intimate partner violence or relational stalking might be able to access. So again, I don't have a magic cure for that, but we want to acknowledge these gaps and spend some time on the front end, right? Be intentional, do some brainstorming, and think about what ways can we fill those gaps, right? What ways can we shore up this process to improve the process and to increase the amount of relief available to victims? So let's talk really quickly about work and about campus. We know we already talked about the significant disruption in particularly acquaintance stalking victims, significant disruption in their life. And we know particularly related to work that can have a big impact. But we also know on college campuses, this is a somewhat of a unique victim population, but also the impact, the effect, what that might look like, and also the process for a victim of stalking might look very different. Kendra, I want to kick it to you for just a bit and tell us a little bit about maybe the process of obtaining relief on campus, how that might look different for a non-relational victim, and how that might play out, particularly relative to kind of disruption on campus.
Yeah, I think if you even look just here at this pie chart, the majority isn't intimate partner, whether it's current or former, right? It's classmates or roommates or friends on campus. So again, Title IX in and of itself is, or I say again, to mention Title IX is a confusing process. It's not black and white, it's not clear cut, especially if a student is trying to navigate that on their own and they don't know that they can go to their advocate on campus, if their campus even has an advocate. And so whenever I was navigating that process with students, getting a no contact order, that's the campus protection order essentially. But I would always stress to students that goes two ways. If you get a no contact order on campus under Title IX, they're very specific about the respondent cannot contact the complainant or the victim, and the victim cannot contact the respondent at all. And a lot of times, regardless of if it was an intimate partner relationship or not, students aren't always either able to do that because they're in class together or in the same organizations. And so if I have a no contact order, can I raise my hand in class and respond to something that they say? Or if they respond to something that I say, is that a violation? So I just think that it's not as clear cut on college. It's not clear cut in protective orders in general, but on a college campus, you just have to realize how intertwined these students' lives are and the impact if it is a person of authority on campus, whether that is someone that's overseeing their scholarship or their graduate assistant internship placement or their employer on campus. Again, these relationships are not often just singular relationships with college students. Oftentimes there's a lot of overlap. And so navigating and making sure that if they are seeking those no contact orders, that they are in the place to be able to cut off that contact as well. And navigating safety. We talk about this on and off campus, right? It's not always the safest option for victims to completely cut off contact with their offender, with their stalker, because they are negotiating and navigating for safety. And we heard Natalie mention victims saying it's like being hunted. And that second part of their quote is, if you're being hunted, don't you want to know where your hunter is? And part of that is maybe not cutting off that contact, knowing where they are, still allowing them to text them, hey, I'm about to show up at work, or I'm following you after class, or I'm waiting for you after class, knowing that what to expect. And so I think college students especially are having to navigate that safety. And also they're in a time in their life where they're still navigating forming interpersonal relationships and doing a lot of this on their own and gaining that autonomy for the first time on their own. And so also feeling like they can handle these victimizations or when they get into trouble on their own. And so letting them know that they're not alone. Again, making sure that they know what services are available regardless of the nature of the relationship, and really letting them lead the way in that safety planning. What does your day-to-day on campus look like? What is this going to impact? Is it your organizations? Is it your financial aid, your internship, all of those intricacies that come into those non-singular relationships on campus?
Yeah, absolutely. And I moved through a slide there that talked about statistics. I think we already covered that, but I think that's some great insight from Kendra, particularly taking into account that when we're on campus, it becomes a different bubble, right? And that bubble in and of itself can create a really unique dynamic. It can affect safety planning. It can affect all those things that Kendra mentioned. So thank you for sharing that. Something that we certainly want to think critically about when we think about our response, particularly on campus. So in general, we talk through things like making sure on campus, what is that policy? What is that protocol? How are we offering services? What does it look like? These are some suggestions. And one of the things we talk about with these awareness months is it's an opportunity to increase that communication, right? We talked about that right at the beginning, that words have power. And if we are on a campus, if we're in that bubble, we can use that opportunity. We can use those awareness months, these kind of public campaigns to improve our communication and make sure it's very clear, very clearly articulated to our student population, our campus population as a whole, what we deem to be crimes, right? What services are available, how we can respond to those. All of the information that we know is so vital in making sure that our victims are reporting this crime and that they are receiving the services that they need. So we know, and this is not a surprise to any of us here on this call, but we know that all of these questions, I've asked you to really think about all of these different systems, right? And I am going to guess, if you were doing a little internal audit during this webinar, thinking through your own systems, there's probably little gaps, maybe some bigger gaps, but probably in just about every system in your community, right? We all have areas or arenas where we can improve our response. And so we want to make sure that we're making this a global conversation, that we're doing our part in whatever arena, whatever role that might be, but that we are also bringing along our partners at the same time to really improve and increase the response for these victims. So we talked about using the slide framework to make sure that we're identifying them. And we have some recommendations on improving, if you're part of a coordinated community response, improving your response to stalking within those CCRs. And I always want to remind folks, because I do remember doing the work enough to know that nobody needs another meeting on their calendar, right? Nobody really needs another group to be part of necessarily. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to create another meeting for everyone. But what you can do is incorporate that stalking lens into all the meetings that are already on your calendar. So if you do that, you can really improve the conversation. You can inherently raise awareness. You can start to ask and answer some of these questions that we've talked about today. Hey, law enforcement, what are we doing? What does that look like? When are we doing risk assessments? And how do you know to do risk assessments? Whatever questions you might have about your partner's response and what that might look like, we have some resources specific to help identify stalking in all different industry-specific fields. But I mentioned earlier, we may want to make sure that we are recognizing, we are preparing ourselves. I am sad to say this is around the corner. January will be here before we know it. We are almost through the month of October. And so we want to be prepared to acknowledge, to recognize this. This gives us such a good opportunity to increase and to clarify that community communication, right? And make sure that we are really intentional in reaching all victims of stalking. We really want to highlight too the Peggy Klinke Award. So this was our first year in awarding this, and we really would encourage some nominations. If you know someone who's doing a positive, who's making a positive difference, doing positive work in this field of stalking intervention, maybe in supporting survivors of stalking, you can go on our site and nominate them. We love to hear from the folks who are doing this work and all of the great things that you are doing. I will be honest, I'm so curious about some of these questions that we talked about here today and some of these responses. I am encouraged. It sounds to me like we've got a lot of great folks in the field, and the fact that we have all of these folks joining us here today tells me that we have folks who care and folks who are paying attention to this crime specifically. So something to keep in mind, and we would love, like I said, to hear some nominations from you all about folks who are doing great work. I started with this. I will finish with this. This is our site where you can find our resources. You can follow us on social media. I would really encourage you to check this out. I won't totally finish with that because I am going to share our contact information as well. This is my email address, my phone number. You can get in touch with me if you have any questions, have any thoughts. As I mentioned, we're available to help with trainings, with technical assistance. If you want to brainstorm a question that maybe you've got going, maybe a case that you're working on, we would love to talk and offer any resources or insight that we can. So this is my information, and this is Kendra's. So particularly if you've got questions for Kendra relative to campuses, and I know that there were some questions in the chat that we may not have all the time to get to today, but feel free to reach out. Let us know. Follow up with us. If you can't tell in the last hour and a half you've spent with me, I could talk about this all day, every day. So you are doing me a favor if you reach out, let me know about the work that you're doing. I love to hear from you guys. And I want to take the opportunity, I know Kendra will probably do the same, but I just am so grateful for partners and folks in the field who commit an hour and a half of their incredibly valuable time to be part of this conversation. And thank you for participating. I appreciate your willingness to share information and to improve the conversation here today and give us some real perspective about what's happening across the country. All right, Kendra, do you have any closing thoughts, comments?
No, we have a couple minutes if you wanted to go through a question or two. I was going to say there were some Title IX questions. I absolutely love campus advocacy and Title IX stuff. So please reach out to me if you want to talk more one-on-one about that. I don't know if you want me to go through any of the questions, but like Natalie said, I do want to reiterate, we absolutely love to connect with people one-on-one, whether it's to talk about individual cases or just improving your community's response, your organization's response, or just the work that you're doing. Please connect with us one-on-one. We'd be happy to jump on a phone call, email back and forth, anything that works best for you. We are happy to do that. But I don't know.
I think some of our
Timeline.
questions are a little bit specific. I think I would prefer if y'all would mind to
Mhm.
send those to us. You can send them to us via email, and that way we can dig down into the specificity with all of the folks that we have here today. I want to make sure we're keeping this information relative and to some degree maybe a little bit more general in terms of ways that we can provide support and information. But I would love to drill down, and yeah, our host just reminded me we'll have access to the questions when we get a report from this, and we can maybe, I know some of the questions came in anonymously, but if anybody wants to reach out, they can send those to us, and we'd be happy to start a conversation and discussion and maybe give some guidance and direction on what's going on in your community and what that might look like for you. All right, I think that's all I've got. And we are right on time. Whew, that's always a struggle for me. So I'm always glad when we see us
And
come in right
two
under
of
the
us on the
clock.
call, we could have gone way over. So
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We'll hang around for just a bit, but thank you. Thank you. I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.